Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar, Compatibility Testing for Mobile Apps and Websites. My name is Michael and I am glad to see all of you here. Hope you'll enjoy it. Now this webinar, before I start, I want to say a couple of words about it. This webinar is a topic from a larger class that I teach, or I should say perhaps a series of classes, and it handles one of the more important aspects in mobile devices, or compatibility testing. Now, a few words about myself here. My name is Michael Yudanin. I've been in the area of software quality since the 1990s. I am a certified software quality engineer by the American Society for Quality. Worked in a variety of areas of QA testing, test engineer, manager, practice director, lead consultant and CEO of Conflare, which I've been running since 2006, worked with a variety of companies and have a particular particular inclination, I should say, perhaps affinity to mobile, manual and automated. Yet enough about me. Let's proceed to you now. Any questions are totally welcome. Please use the interface, the web conferencing interface, the GoToMeeting interface to submit your questions. At the end, we certainly will have a place for all the questions, and I will answer them all, trying to group similar questions into certain groups. Okay. The contents. First, I will provide a very quick refresher on compatibility testing for a few minutes perhaps, and then we'll go deeper into that. We'll discuss different compatibility factors, first in general and then more in depth particular to mobile. Here I will also try to emphasize why compatibility testing is so important specifically for the world of mobile devices. It's perhaps as important, as crucial as compatibility testing was for the web in the late 90s, early 2000s. And perhaps even more due to certain technological and usage characteristics. And then we'll proceed to the main part of this webinar, how to plan compatibility tests for mobile platforms. And I will try to suggest a certain sequence of steps, certain method, the purpose of which is to focus on the really important compatibility tests, save time and increase quality. As we all know, perhaps the only way to both make things cheaper and better without blowing your budget is to have a method which will allow you to handle all three. Compatibility testing is but one class of different testing classes. We all know and do functional tests, performance tests, usability, security, interoperability, the ability to work with different systems which it needs to interface, which our system under test needs to interface, survivability and recovery. Another aspect extremely important for mobile, an ability to survive certain kinds of failures and recover from failures. Not a topic for today's webinar, but certainly very important. User acceptance tests also has particular issues with mobile, production monitoring and such. Compatibility is one test class which focuses on the ability of the system under test. Not just an application or a website you're testing, but the whole system the user is utilizing. The user wouldn't care if the failure happened because of the bug in your native app or because there was an update to the operating system and your app couldn't install on it, right? We are talking about the system under test to function as required on all the supported platforms, whether we are talking about hardware platforms, software platforms, browsers, and such, right? As such, compatibility testing certainly touches upon other kinds of tests. There are overlaps. For example, some compatibility failures will result in survivability and recovery issues, particularly for mobile devices. And that's fine. I would suggest to see this delineation of different test classes as a net that we weave to catch defects, and if the net is a bit more dense in certain places, if they overlap, even better. Now, why wouldn't it be the same on all platforms? Why a native app that I developed and which is supposed to run on different versions of iOS wouldn't run on all versions of iOS? Why the website that I developed wouldn't run on all browsers? Theoretically, it is supposed to. That's the whole point. That's the point of standardizing HTML, for example. However, there are issues. And compatibility testing is one of those areas where we as test engineers need to go deeper, a bit deeper into the technology. First, if I have a web app or a hybrid app, which is a native app which can serve web pages from inside the app itself, right? I have the problem of interpretation. We have HTML tags which can be interpreted differently by different mobile browsers. For example, I can have a table tag where I don't specify the color of the border of the table. So one browser might render the border as black, another one as gray, a third one as white, because I haven't specified it. Now imagine that in one of those browsers, the background is rendered gray as well by default. You wouldn't see a table. But that's little money. We have bigger issues with interpretation. Today, responsive design is in vogue. With responsive design, I can design a website which will render itself nicely on each possible screen, on each screen size. It will make it smaller on a smaller screen. It will make it larger on a larger one. It will reposition controls in a way which are convenient to use. Great idea. Excellent idea. The problem, though, is that responsive design heavily relies on CSS, cascading style sheets, and in many times JavaScript. Those are at the mercy of the browser. If I have one of the mobile browsers which is not as good in rendering certain aspects of JavaScript or CSS as others, we might be well in trouble here. And unfortunately, mobile browsers today are somewhere where regular browsers were, let's say, 10, 15 years ago in terms of the ability to render JavaScript. Only a few years ago, most of them became capable of rendering JavaScript. So here, I want to make sure that my nice responsive design runs on all the supported platforms and runs correctly, that the user indeed sees those buttons the user needs to click and in the right place. We have, of course, the issue of operating system. Installation, one of the Achilles heels of any native app. Installation is usually an invasive procedure. You go into the depth of the operating system. In many cases, you need to interface elements of the hardware. We have platforms which differ in terms of hardware and version of operating system. Installation can be a place where defects lurk. Rendering images, right? One operating system can be better at rendering images than the other, not to mention hardware. Using operating systems objects, another pitfall. Many native apps use objects which are part of the operating system, for example, collection object for a list of items. You have a new version of the operating system, they change something in the collection, doesn't work anymore. Very common case. Memory. Usually we don't care for that on the PC because the architecture of the memory is pretty much the same. Not so on mobile devices. They vary widely and wildly in terms of the amount of memory and also differ in terms of how it's built, how it's architected. If I have an application which is memory intensive, for example, a native app which renders itself differently in portrait and landscape mode, I need to test it on different devices with different amounts and architecture of memory. Very same thing applies to the CPU. They differ widely in their capacity on multiple devices. Of course, we have security restrictions. Think about installation, right? Security restrictions are right here. Display size and resolution. Once it was a big problem on the PC, today it's a big problem for mobile. And it's not only a question of resolution per se, but the way it renders the image, retina display, for example, right? I want to make sure my app, my website render correctly on different display sizes with different resolutions. All those are certainly issues of compatibility. All those are factors that can impact compatibility. Now, just to give a taste of, the diversity of those factors, the most common ones, browsers. Anybody who thinks that no user on Android platform, or no substantial amount of users on Android platform, install custom browser is mistaken. It's very common there to install Google Chrome, for example. You might have a particular population which uses IE for mobile devices, for example, employees of certain company which mandates using IE on mobile devices as possible. Operating system itself, on the PC you have a whole variety. Same applies to mobile devices. Android Nougat, the latest one, had quite a few changes which are relevant to compatibility. Same applies to iOS 10, and today you have, iOS 10.2 point something and so on. Some changes might be relevant to your app. Same applies to hardware. Hardware matters a lot, and it's much more diverse on mobile devices than it is on the PC and on Mac. We have the major app players in the mobile world. We have our Apple iOS devices, iPhone versions and iPad versions, right? We also have today wearable devices, for example, Apple Watch, and many apps would run on that too. You have Android devices with much more variety. There are a couple of important differences between Apple and Android which make compatibility testing a bit more time-consuming affair on Androids. For Apple, there is one company which makes hardware, one company which makes operating system. It's a closed walled garden. For Android, it's an open field. Anybody can make Android hardware. Anybody can make changes, they call them flavors of the Android operating system, right? So if Android users is your target audience, budget more time for compatibility testing. And I will continue banging on this particular point with Android. Windows is also a player here after a couple of problematic attempts, problematic forays into mobile space. They seem to settle on Surface, which is becoming more and more popular, their tablet. They also work with phones, of course. Now they're trying to make Windows 10 as one platform, one operating system across all platforms. Something certainly to watch. Very different architecture. One of the psychological problems with mobile Windows is that many developers think in terms of Windows for PC and not in terms of mobile. And this certainly has an impact on which fonts they use, for example, right? What size of buttons they use, which is very important for mobile devices, right? Of course, we have operating system versions for iOS devices. We have flavors and versions for Android. For Android, operating system versions are usually named after condiments. For example, marshmallow, nougat, they had gingerbread ones, and so on. I wonder what they do when they got to Z right now. And you have also today hybrid apps, which is certainly something to watch for. They're becoming more and more popular. The idea is rather simple. You have a native app which you install, but this app itself calls upon the browser engine object from the device's operating system and renders pages which is served from the server inside this object. It also can store pages locally. Now those are web pages, and the allure is that you design a web page once and it runs in your PC browser and Mac browser and in your native hybrid app. If the device is not connected to the internet, you can store this page locally and serve locally. The trouble is, of course, compatibility testing. You have here both all the aspects of the native app, installation, operating system dependency and such, and all the aspects of the web because they use the local device's browser engine object. You have also an issue of carrier compatibility. Some of the functionalities might be dependent on the quality of connection, but also on the type of connection, G4, right? So other types of connections, and a particular carrier with the changes which many of us await without any desire and await rather with sense of despair that would allow internet carriers to give preference to this or that kind of traffic. Carrier compatibility as compatibility factor might become more and more important. Right now it's not a major issue, but something to watch for. We might have functionalities dependent on the carrier becoming more popular in the near future. Now, why particular importance for mobile? Compatibility testing for mobile devices is particularly important because devices differ much more than PC and Mac platforms in terms of the capacity of the CPU, and the difference can be huge, right? In terms of memory size, same applies. In terms of display size and the quality of display, very important for mobile. Even in terms of the way your finger interacts with the display, sometimes a click is required, the physical contact. Sometimes you can hover with your finger above the screen very closely, and the button will be clicked, works on the electromagnetic effect. So hardware is very different. And I don't even want to start with the camera and quality of the camera and the type of the camera and the GPS and so on and so forth. All this is right here. Operating systems differ greatly. Your Android and your iOS, even though both are built on Linux-like systems, are still very different. Browsers differ greatly, carriers, technology, everything differs. And that's the point to remember, that you don't have only iPads and Androids. You also have special devices like ruggedized ones, the ones they use in quality control, the ones they use in the stores. The store associates use them, right? So these are also mobile devices, something to keep in mind. There are three main questions that I ask every time I approach compatibility testing. And here we are starting to get into the method. First, how do we know on which devices we should run the tests? Number one. Second, how do we know what tests should we execute on which devices and for which carriers? Right? These are two very different questions. It well might be that I have 30 different devices rather prevalent in my target user population, but I want to run my tests only on 5 because only they are substantially different and can impact the way my application runs. So what tests should we execute on devices carriers is the second question, answered after the first, and has different factors that impact it. And the third one, of course, what should we do, what should the app do or a website do when installed on or opened on an unsupported platform? I will start with the third question because it's the easiest, but it's also the easiest to miss. The problem here is not that your web page, for example, will not open at all in an unsupported mobile browser. The problem is that it will open, and the user will fill out the form, but the JavaScript behind the submit button wouldn't work. And then the user will click and click and click it, and nothing happens, and the user gets really frustrated, and that's the last time they approach your mobile website. The problem is not that your native app wouldn't install at all in an unsupported version of iOS. It will install right, but then 1/4 of the functionality wouldn't work, and the user will get really frustrated, uninstall the app, write a bad review, and never use anything from you again, because the competition is right there in the Apple App Store. Right? It's not the problem that your application wouldn't run at all on a certain Android phone. The trouble is that it would run, but then once you change it from landscape to portrait a number of times, let's say carrying it in the pocket without switching off, the device will crash because of the memory leak and that part of this flavor of the operating system, which is responsible for recalculating all the pixels on the screen. A real case, by the way, for some mobile devices. So the problem with the unsupported platform is that some functionality wouldn't work. That would be extremely frustrating. So what should we do? Well, of course, we should give a clear notice to the user that this website will not open on this platform, in this browser, and wouldn't open it. But you also, as a test engineer, you want to go a bit beyond that and make sure that A, it's clear to the user why the website didn't open. For example, this browser is not supported, and of course what to do. For example, we support browser such and such, or use our native app. It also needs to be in the user's language. Now here, it might be a step into the usability, but all the same is very important. First, in the most primitive sense, you target users in Japan. Make sure it's in Japanese. Second, it should be something that users understand. If it says error 2567, call the support, that's not what we want here, right? And if you as a test engineer are not clear about what the message means, you can be certain the users wouldn't. Same applies, of course, to the native app. or hybrid app, it shouldn't install on an unsupported platform, a platform for which it was not tested, right? For this reason, you should have in your test lab browsers you don't support, platforms in general don't support, try to install it there, try to open it there, make sure it doesn't install, doesn't open, the user gets the right message. That's a test that can take a minute or two. But if you miss it, it can cause the user a whole lot of frustration. And now we are getting into the core of it. The first two questions. Now, before I proceed, I want to make sure that we as test engineers answer two preliminary questions, called the questions 0.1 and 0.2. First, do we have requirements for compatibility? Is it written anywhere in our requirements document or our stories or anything else? What are the platforms we support? Which browsers, which mobile operating systems, which versions, which flavors, which hardware? If it is not written in the requirements, as a good test engineer, I'll go right back and say, hey, I need a list of what we support. Let's think about that. Once I have the requirements, I will ask another question. Are they adequate? This is a principal thing. If I see today requirements for a native app which is supposed to serve, for example, a doctor's population, and it says it's a native app, it supports Marshmallow for Android, I would come back to my business analyst and say, hey, I looked at the statistics first, even though Android is the majority of new sales and a very big chunk of the US market, for doctors, iOS is the king of the hill, and here are my numbers. I got the statistics, we'll talk about that. Second, even for Androids, Nougat is the new operating system. If we don't support it, we'll be out very soon. People would not hold off on updating their operating system because our app, one of few dozens at least, if not hundreds, they have on the device, doesn't support the new one. These are not adequate requirements, right? Same applies to hardware. If somebody supports today iPhone 6 but not iPhone 7, that's a very good reason for me to raise the problem. As a test engineer, I'm not the one to make the decision, but I'm certainly the one to report about the issue, right? So once we answer those two, then I want to look deeper. First, I want to look at the users. Who are my users? What user groups? How do I analyze that? Second, I want to look at the platforms and carriers which are most common among my user group and get some hard numbers here. Third, I want to look at the operating systems and browsers, if relevant for me, mobile browsers, common among my user group. And only after I have all those nailed down, then I look at perhaps the most complex aspect of it. What aspects, what elements of our native app or hybrid app or mobile website are sensitive to hardware and software platform differences? And what I want to do now, in the rest of the time that is left for us, is to go through each one of those items and even give some examples with the last one. First of all, who is using our app and website? Right? This is a question which I would ask my business analysts. I personally also would think about it myself. I would try to get any statistics from our sales department if available, but I will also go to our salespeople, to our product managers, and ask them whom we are intending this application for. And with this last group, I might get some surprises. For example, every time we have a major update for an application, I would ask why we are doing this update. And sometimes it's relevant in terms of which users do we serve. For example, we want now to roll it out to a different country, Germany, India, China. For example, we might now start serving more populations, for example, students. This is very relevant for my demographics. They might use different devices, right? They might use different languages, different alphabets, different measures. If I know now that our application will be rolled out in China, for example, I'll ask a question whether the menus will be in Chinese, whether it's supposed to support Chinese inputs. Most certainly it will, even if the menus are in English and such. If people need to add their names, for example, right? I need to be ready to test for that. And I can tell stories about supporting different languages. What about the weights and measures? We used to be US only, now we are rolling it out to Canada. Now we have kilometers, right? Now we still have a gallon, but that's an imperial gallon, which is larger than the US gallon. So all those questions I want to nail down and make sure that our application does support it. Does it venture from compatibility a bit to functionality? Yes. I still need to test it, right? Moreover, if it's a general public, the spread of the devices usually would be very different in comparison to specific groups. For example, if we are supposed to serve businessmen as one of our target populations, I still probably need to look at BlackBerry. It's still popular in some countries, particularly in Canada, among businessmen, right? Becoming less popular, but still there. If we are going to serve doctors and nurses and other medical professionals, then it is very important for me to see how do I mimic, not at your desk use, and of course they use different kind of devices too. Pretty much in any industry where reliability is the utmost concern, industrial quality control, military, medical, we have a prevalence of iOS devices, right? Will it be used in retail by shoppers, by associates, right? And then if this is the case, and it's used by, let's say, associates, I have captive audience where the company can mandate certain devices. My next step is to ask what are our largest clients, let's say Target, for example, what devices are they going to use? My life here would be a bit easier. Is it going to be used by academics? And then Mac integration is very important. Is it going to be used by traveling public? If it is the case, then I must make sure it's compatible with different connectivities, right? And there are many usability concerns here as well, by the way, which go beyond our webinar. Is it going to be used by college students? If this is the case, then I cannot avoid different flavors of Android. College students have lots of different Androids, right? They are generally poorer than the larger population. Androids are cheaper. So the time I dedicate to compatibility testing, the devices I need in my lab would be different. Is it going to be used by seniors? It also has lots of usability implications, but also I will ask which devices are popular among my target population here. Tablets, for example, are very popular with seniors, perhaps even more popular than smartphones. Phablets as well, sort of a smaller tablet which also functions as a phone. Frankly, almost all tablets can function as a phone, we just don't use them this way, right? So first I nail down my demographics, right? My second stage is to see what devices, what versions of operating system, what browsers I use in my target audience, right? And here you have lots of statistical information on the web. Gartner provides excellent statistical analysis. StatCounter provides decent analysis. But there is also another source which you might use, sort of a gold mine you have in your own backyard, and that's the log of your server for your corporate website or your client's corporate website, which logs all the versions and types of browsers used to access it. From here, you might see how many times your corporate website is accessed by mobile browsers and what kind of mobile browsers are those. If your target audience is a captive audience, employees of certain companies which give them mobile devices to run the app you're going to test, you can just ask them. It's no shame to ask your clients what do they need. Moreover, it can be good PR for your company. If you are dealing with a global audience in general, your audience is the whole wide world. You work for Facebook, you work for Skype, right? You're testing an operating system for mobile device. Then you need to perhaps spend more time, perhaps a few dozen hours sometimes, to nail down what's the usage of different platforms in your target audience. And that can vary greatly from country to country. Here is a chart that demonstrates it. For example, if we look at North America, then Apple has a fairly large share. Same applies, by the way, to Japan. Samsung also have a very large share in North America. If you look at Latin America, Samsung does hold some very significant ground, but Apple is much less prevalent, right? This chart, however, is outdated, as would be any chart or any statistic you collected, let's say 3, 4, 6 months ago. One of the challenges of the mobile world is that it is changing very quickly. The statistic about browser use and device use you have from 3 months ago might be totally outdated now for some markets. So what I usually suggest here is that in your testing methodology, you will outline where do you look for statistics, your server log, stat counter, Gartner, other sources, and every time you're preparing for a new test cycle, you refresh your statistics, go to those sources and get the new numbers and see if you, for example, need to throw away certain devices from your lab or buy new ones. Or if you use external lab, you can, of course, rent the devices. If you need to install new browsers, if you need to have any new updates for the operating system and such, right? So any chart you have from a while ago would be outdated, will become outdated very soon. And that's also the time you need to budget. The refreshing of statistics can take half a day, a day. Building the first time, building a method can take a bit more, dozens of hours sometimes. But this is something that you cannot avoid. If you tested for the state of the market for a few months ago, that wouldn't fly anymore. Okay? So we have those two by now. We have our target population, and we have what they actually use. Wonderful. So now let's go further. Right? Now let's see what are the particular factors in this spread of devices which might impact compatibility. Right? First, we are talking about the type of devices they use. Smartphones, tablets, others, the mix between the smartphone and the tablet, the phablet, sort of smaller tablet. You might also have ruggedized devices which they use in the stores and warehouses and medical and the military and so on. So I might want to categorize the devices my customers use into those different categories. And from here, see what they might be relevant for. For example, rendering a website on tablet versus smartphone is usually different because they have different sizes. Right? Sometimes rendering the same image in higher resolution might be a problem because it will become sort of grainy. The image itself has low resolution. Right? And that's but one of the examples. Right? Now, then I want to look at the manufacturer. Is this the case that much of our target population uses Androids? If this is the case indeed, which Androids? One of the problems, perhaps the major problem of Androids, is that the different manufacturers of Android devices tend to over-customize things. They're not content with providing different cameras and different CPUs and different, look and feel of the devices, different memory architectures. They also customize the operating system, create flavors. There are a few areas where those customizations are particularly problematic. One of those is the country configuration, weights and measures. You can have one Android device with the same version of the operating system where the manufacturer customized it in a way where you just select a country. You go from US to Canada, boom, you select Canada. And this changes pretty much everything in terms of weights and measures. You cannot say, well, I am in Canada now, but I still want to use miles. Another device, another manufacturer customized it a bit differently, and there you can still choose miles. If you have an application where people report mileage to collect certain monetary returns from their employers, expense reimbursement, that can be a problem. Language. If all what you choose as language of some devices behave, that might be a problem. Spanish Mexico and Spanish US, there is such a thing, and Spanish Spain can be different. Same applies to English Canada, English US. There are slight differences in Britain. So this is something certainly to watch for, right? And then, of course, the manufacturer means CPU, memory, camera, and all this jazz. If you have a native app which interfaces with the camera frequently, let's say, can scan barcodes, then you certainly need to test with different types of cameras and different hardware. Then, of course, I can categorize it by display size and resolution and see if it's relevant for my application. I mentioned one area of special hardware, and that's camera utilization. There is more. You can have add-ons. And if your application uses special add-ons for, let's say, credit card scanning, or add-ons to the camera for barcode scanning or taking better images, this is something you want to have in your lab and make sure your native app is compatible with that. Another area of compatibility are different GPS systems. We are all familiar with the big player in the market, the United States Global Positioning System, which gave name to the whole area. But there is more. There are some devices which work with GPS and with something else. For example, European Galileo, Russian GLONASS, Chinese Baidu, and so on. If this is the case, you want to make sure that your native app gets the right location no matter what the device is. It's relevant for a small segment of the application, but still something to watch for. As any kind of special hardware with which you need to be compatible. So as you're probably sensing, we are moving from more general issues to more specific, the ones which will help us to build a table, and then look at the functionalities sensitive to all those things. Same applies to software. iOS version would be relevant for any kind of install of any kind of native or hybrid app. Same applies to the flavor and version of Android. There is another issue which I haven't addressed by now but needs to be addressed, and that's jailbreaking and rooting. Because of the shortage of time, I will not do my usual spiel about jailbreaking and rooting. In a nutshell, we are talking about a fairly innocuous operation where we give the user of the device access to the admin user which is built into the device anyways. We are not breaking into anybody's vault here, right? Rooting is for Android, jailbreaking for iOS devices. Millions upon millions of people do that. There are special applications which work only with jailbroken rooted devices. But here, the compatibility question is this. First, should our application, is our application supposed to support jailbroken iOS devices and rooted Android devices? If this is the case, I want to make sure that it at least installs of those, right? If it should not support jailbroken rooted devices, here is my compatibility test case right away. I will have an already jailbroken device in my lab. I will try to install it on it. It should give me a nice error message. The device has been jailbroken. Cannot install application on it. Please use not jailbroken device. Same applies to rooted Android. Then I have another test case. I have a non-jailbroken device. I install my app. Then I jailbreak it. And then I go into the app. It's not supposed to work and should give a nice error message as well, and perhaps even try to uninstall itself. This you will clarify with the business analysts, but that's compatibility, full jailbreaking and rooting. Another thing to know about it is this. Since the user has access to the admin, built-in admin user on the device, on a jailbroken iOS device or rooted Android device, the user can install all kinds of apps the user wants, including apps that encroach on other apps' memory. One of the questions as a compatibility tester I would ask my system architect is this relevant to our app? And this question, is this relevant to our app, you will hear more and more in the rest of the presentation. In fact, compatibility testing is best planned together with your architect because it will have quite a few technical questions. Same, of course, applies to browser. Do we expect our target population to use a standard browser on the device, let's say Safari on iOS, or some other browser, let's say Google Chrome for iOS? On Androids, Google Chrome is quite prevalent, so you cannot avoid it. On iOS less, but you might want to go to a server log and see how many people access it from mobile Google Chrome, right? Something certainly to know. Moreover, another tricky thing about Google Chrome for iOS is that it still uses components of the operating system itself. So a new version of the operating system might impact the way your web page is rendered in Google Chrome on iOS. Something certainly to watch for. So we got the hardware. We know which devices we will use. which operating system on those devices, their prevalence in our target population. Some can be 50%, another can be 20%, another can be 2%, right? We know what are the factors that can impact our app or our browser related to hardware, related to software. There probably is no native app for which all those factors are relevant and no mobile website for which all those factors are relevant, but you can use it as a checklist and see what's relevant to yours, right? And then we go into the third stage, the technology. And here I'm trying to answer a question, which tests I should run on which platforms. Now, to make it more practical, let's have an example of an imaginary mobile website which is very similar to many mobile websites we encounter. And what we learned from here, you can extrapolate to native apps as well. So here we have an imaginary website called Find Doc, right? It's a mobile website that enables users to find physicians, doctors by one or more conditions, one or more criteria. Location, for example, find doctors in 5 miles around me. I broke my leg, I want to crawl there. Right? Specialization. My kids drove me nuts, I need a psychiatrist right now. Ranking, I want a good psychiatrist. Right? Opening hours, I want somebody open now, and so on. Right? Now, when I read those requirements as a test engineer, particularly compatibility test engineer, I immediately start thinking what kind of populations might use this kind of new mobile website. And the first thing I think about are, of course, travelers. And in particular, traveling businessmen, big chunk of travelers, and families traveling with kids. Don't know about you, but when my kids were little, they could be healthy for a year, and then you travel to somewhere, and then boom. They're sick, they need a doctor, whatever. So somebody, for example, boarding the plane might try to look up, let's say, a pediatrician in the point of destination, right? Now, knowing that this is going to serve traveling public immediately tells me a few things about compatibility factors. I will start with something which is at the periphery of compatibility. For traveling people carry bags. They need large buttons on the screen because their hands are shaking. Traveling people have little patience. There has been a research many years ago about the differences between psychological time and astronomical real time, where when you're waiting for somebody, the time flies for you faster. 30 seconds have passed, and you feel it like 1.5 to 3 minutes, right? Something I should accommodate, right, if I want my users to stay. I cannot require them to have many clicks. But then, of course, if we are thinking about people traveling with kids, well, we might think about people using tablets. Tablets frequently serve as an electronic babysitter. If I think about traveling businessmen, I probably cannot forgo BlackBerry. Those couple of percentage points might be important for me. This might be the clients who will click on my ads, right? I also would think about internet connection here. Now, as a mobile website, that naturally requires internet connection to function. It utilizes a backend database that has a web-based management interface. Somebody on the backend is entering new physicians or changing their specialization if put an error. And we are interfacing it from the front, right? So here, performance, of course, will become a serious problem. But for me, compatibility-wise, I want to try and test it with different types of connectivity. With Wi-Fi, no Wi-Fi, and so on. Now, each update of the backend database will be reflected on the mobile end within 5 minutes, something I will test perhaps as part of my functional test. Now, the next point is crucial for any mobile testing. Unfortunately, frequently it's forgotten, and that's perhaps one of the major reasons for the doom of many native apps and mobile websites. This mobile website is free and serves ads that are renewed every set interval of time. That means we leave off those ads. That means they are crucial. That means I want to make sure they displayed correctly in different browsers. They change one after another. I also, as a side note, want to make sure they displayed when I have high load and low load. Not exactly compatibility, but something to look at. one of the major problems with ads is that if your mobile website is built in a way where other content gets preference, ads might not be displayed at all if the server experiences high load. And then you're losing money exactly when you want to earn them, right? So this is something for me to test very carefully. Right? Then there is another point. Find dog can be used in the US, Canada, Germany, and Japan. This immediately tells me where I need to look for my statistics. This immediately tells me I need to make sure that when, let's say, somebody from the US is traveling to Germany, she will get distances both in miles and kilometers, right? This immediately tells me that somebody traveling from US to Japan shouldn't get immediately all the interface in Japanese, but still stick to English. And the reverse applies to people from Japan traveling to the United States. They still should have interface in Japanese. It also immediately tells me a few more things. As a good test engineer, I want to research whether same terms apply to same doctor specializations in different countries. For example, in the US, a therapist means usually psychotherapist or psychoanalytic. In many other countries, it means just family doctor. Something to watch for, not exactly compatibility, but something quite important. So from here, I map my users. They are traveling businessmen and parents with kids mostly. I guess I made an assumption that traveling college students wouldn't get sick that easily, right? However, maybe it's a wrong assumption. You might want to explore it with, let's say, your product management, sales, right? Then I ask the question, well, what tablets and smartphones are popular within our target group? Again, I make an assumption that ruggedized devices are not exactly what those people carry. Perhaps worth checking, but that's quite a common sense assumption, right? And after asking this question, as we discussed, I will go to the statistics and I will try to build a little matrix, a little table of tablets and smartphones in this group. Now, then I ask, what browsers do our users utilize? It's a mobile website. It's quite an important question, right? If I have a previous version, I can try to look at my server logs. I can try to look at browser trends in this kind of population. I can look at similar apps and websites elsewhere, right? But I need some kind of list of browsers and their prevalence on different platforms. And then comes the main question. What functionality will be sensitive to different software and hardware combinations? Sensitivity analysis is something that you do last here, but that's where you focus. That's the most important thing. All the rest was a preparation for it, if you wish. What parts of your app or website are most sensitive to which hardware and software features of your intended platforms, given the expected pattern of use? So these are the three issues here. What parts are more sensitive to the particular hardware and software features of the platforms you are going to target in your target population, given the expected pattern of use, given what they are going to do with it? For example, if we're talking about Find Doc, we probably will have some kind of JavaScript validation that they chose all the necessary criteria to proceed, right? Well, JavaScript runs in the browser. I must test it in different browsers. It is much less, the operating system is much less relevant to it, right? So here, for example, if I am in a hurry, I probably wouldn't test it on both iOS 9 and iOS 10. I would test it on iOS 10, but in different browsers. Now, is rendering images relevant to my app? If yes, then I must test it in different display sizes. I want to make sure my image is not stretched beyond recognition on a higher resolution display, right? I want to make sure my image is presented correctly on a lower resolution display, right? So I know the hardware prevalent in my target users, but all the test cases which are about browsing images, I want to run them on devices with different display size. If I have an app that stores and uploads data, then different memory size is relevant. For example, imagine a native app for a real estate agent who will go around, snap pictures of houses, and upload them to the database and let's say put on sale on them, whatever, right? Or go to the house which is on sale, take pictures of everything inside and upload it when the connection becomes available. Now, in this kind of app, I want to make sure that when I use it with devices of different memory size, it still works because it stores things temporarily. And I want to make sure it works with different connectivities I can expect in the field. That's a compatibility test indeed. Redrawing displays on devices with different CPU architectures when switching landscape to portrait mode. Now, if we have a native app which renders the screen differently for portrait and landscape, this test is a must on certain low-end Androids. And why it is so? Here is the sad story. We know already that different manufacturers of Android devices introduce changes to the Android operating system, customize it. Now, I don't want to insult any Android manufacturers, but trouble is that programmers who work for manufacturers, many of them are not exactly the experts in rewriting the kernel of the operating system or rewriting other parts of operating system. So they think they make some innocuous change, but this change actually can cause memory leak. They use somebody else's function, which has been compiled for a long time. They utilize this library. This function is a tiny little memory leak, which nobody has felt in the last 20 years because nobody ever executed this function many times in a row. Right? So they use it, and as a result, there is a tiny little memory leak, which you wouldn't even notice when you turn it portrait to landscape once. But the user who think about the same real estate agent, they probably wouldn't switch the device off at all, wouldn't let it slip. It would be on all the time. Changes landscape, portrait, and then the memory leak grows up, and finally the device crashes. A big problem. It's not such a big problem on iOS devices because of the architecture. Their memory leaks can crash your app, but not the whole website. But on jailbroken iOS devices, it can crash the website because it can grab more memory. Right now you are admin user. Okay? And there are many more questions here. I will mention a few more. If it is a hybrid app, then different platforms are relevant because you installed in different platforms. Different browsers are relevant because you use the browser engine inside your app. Now, many of those questions you want to ask your system architect. And that's, again, not a shame. Moreover, it will help you to build bridges with other parts in the software shop, right? And I frequently do that and get some very valuable input. Now, knowing that, knowing which parts of my application are sensitive to different combinations of hardware and software, I can proceed further. But before we proceed further, a few special cases. If you do anything with the camera, you need to test it with different devices with different cameras. And you might want to go deeper into technology and ask, for example, if, let's say, two different versions of Galaxy use the same camera was upgraded, right? If you use GPS, you might ask the same question. If you use any other, any add-on, then you need to test it with different add-ons, right? Armed with that knowledge, we proceed to the latest step, building compatibility matrix. The idea is the same as doing it for different browsers or different operating systems in the world of Mac and PC. The contents, though, of course, are driven by mobile, right? So here is a very simple, very primitive matrix. The top 3 rows is an outcome of our research that we did prior to asking the question about sensitivity. The rest of the rows are all about sensitivity. So we did the analysis and we decided that in our target population we use Windows Surface, iPad Air, which is most common in our target user groups, iPad Mini, let's say the old iPad Mini, the iPhone 7 and Galaxy, right? Good. We also use different browsers. Windows 10 actually is not a browser, the default browser for Windows 10. Safari, in iPad Air, iPad Mini, and iPhone 7, because the vast majority of our users don't install a new browser. In Galaxy, we use Safari and Chrome. And we have two types of connectivity, the regular network and Wi-Fi. Okay, good. Of course, your real one would be much longer in most cases. Now let's look at different functionalities in our system, and let's see if we need to repeat the test cases for those for all our combinations of software and hardware. Or I will focus this question even further. Very frequently, you would have a test case with multiple data sets. For example, let's say that we can search for a physician by address, right? I wouldn't search just by one address. I will have a whole test data file with perhaps 75 different addresses. Addresses for where we have all the components, the number and the street and the building and the room and what an ATTN and the city and the full zip code of 5+4 and so on. Partial address, for example, there are certain small towns where you don't have a street, it's just the name and the town and zip code. If it's different countries, I want addresses from different countries and so on and so forth, right? As a good test engineer, I would have all those. But then I ask myself a question, well, do I need to repeat searches by all those data sets on all the platforms? And the answer is a resounding no. And why? Because the difference here between different addresses is relevant to the back end, not to the front end. For the front end, the only thing that is different is rendering the results, but it's the same piece of code. For the same piece of code for all kinds of addresses, right? As a result, I want to run one data set. I am paranoid. I would usually do two in each combination, and then to run all of them for my iPad Air. Now, in this particular case, I decided to run all of them for Wi-Fi and for regular connection. And why? I assume that in my application, different addresses would come from different database and performance issues might be of relevance here, right? I decided to be on the safe side, right? Now, same applies when we do search, let's say by current location. I want to exercise it once in every single platform to make sure that in this platform, the API of the browser, when it connects to the GPS of the device, works well with the data I supplied, right? Okay, that makes sense, right? However, I don't need to rerun all those cases because the difference between my different data points plays out in the backend. But now let's look at the display of ads. In terms of the display of ads, what would be very different here, what would matter a lot here, is not so much perhaps a hardware platform alone, but the combination of hardware platform and the browser and the type of connectivity. I want to make sure that when it takes a bit longer to load the ad, that the user just doesn't see a blue rectangle. And that's a combination of what the browser provides in terms of technology, what connectivity do I have, and what is the platform itself. So here then, I would access all of them for iPad Air and Windows Surface and all connectivities. But when I go from iPad Air to iPad Mini to iPhone 7, the difference is only the quality of the CPU. I assumed here that the quality of the CPU wouldn't matter much, and of course, neither the amount of memory, wouldn't matter much for rendering the ads. I might want to run it by my architect as well, but in most cases, this is the case. So then in iPad Mini and iPhone 7, I want to repeat only one data point of displaying the ad in each combination, and certainly not all of them. For Galaxy, I will repeat them all, different platform altogether. Now, I also want to be extra cautious here with the display of ads for the following reason. That's what pays my salary. That's a very important functionality. I want to make sure it works well. I want to be overcautious here. And then we have another point, the country config. Now the country config depends on the operating system. At least that's what I assumed here for the sake of our example. If this is the case, then I want to try it in Windows Surface, in one iOS device, all my cases for country config. But then with Galaxy, I want to try it with Safari and try it with Chrome because it might depend on the browser as well. Right? Let's say some JavaScript is involved, we do it in the browser after all. Right? So a browser communicating with the operating system, learning from it, for example, what is the default for the operating system and then adjusting itself accordingly, or adjusting a default option. Now here, though, it doesn't matter at all whether it's Wi-Fi or the regular network. Now this way, building on the knowledge that I collected during my research on statistics and such, I now don't need to repeat everything everywhere, but focus on where the sensitivities lie. This also would allow me to do some risk analysis. I would see which platforms are most sensitive, where the errors are most likely, and prioritize those tests higher, without breaking the bank, without repeating everything everywhere, but rather focusing on where problem spots might be. And of course, I want to test it on unsupported platforms, make sure it doesn't open and gives the user a decent message. Right? Now, we are pretty much out of time for the core presentation, and I will soon open the webinar for questions. But a few words about other courses. Now, naturally, I teach a whole variety of courses on mobile testing. I have a nice and little special course on programming basics for test professionals and test automation with Selenium, very practical ones. You see it with your computers there and come out with some practical skills. Here's my shameless self-promotion. XML and web services testing, SQL and data quality testing for test professionals, design, execution, and many other testing classes. And as I mentioned before, of course, my main job is actually doing the work and consulting here mostly on more sophisticated kinds of testing, not your regular, here is how you write your test case. We all know that in any case. Questions? That's the time. I welcome any questions on this presentation and on related issues at this point. And please, please utilize the messaging board here, okay, for your questions. Yeah, please utilize the chat to send them. If you just raise your hand, then I wouldn't really see it.
Hey, Michael, this is Tom. Susan, can you hear me? Your mic is now on if you wanted to say something. Wasn't sure maybe that. If there are any questions for Michael, please type those in the question box on your menu there. Well, Michael, it may appears that maybe you did such a fantastic job there.
This is Susan Burgess.
Hey, Susan, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Well, thank you. This is obviously Susan Burgess. I'm the president of the Quality Assurance Association of Maryland. I'd personally like to thank both Michael and QAI for helping us offer this excellent webinar. That's certainly been a good job. I very much appreciate the time and trouble in the last minute putting it together. And of course, Tom Tickner, who runs the Quality Assurance Institute, he's been instrumental to QAM's success over the last 20 years. So I just wanted to say thank you for everybody, and hopefully we can do some more of these in the future. And Michael and I can talk offline and maybe get a copy of your presentation as well.
Sure. Yeah, would be glad to talk. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And all of you, please have a good day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.